The last 5 chapters of Judges are not like the rest of the book. They don't have the same pattern of events. Most of the rest of the book involves that cycle, that pattern of disobedience to God, and then God sending an oppressor, and they crying out, and then God sending a deliverer, and then being faithful as long as that deliverer was there. And so that pattern does not exist in these last 5 chapters. I read today that there are only 3 people mentioned by name in the last 5 chapters. And so it's pretty rare to even find a specific individual. Unless you count the lineage of Jonathan and the actual characters, three characters in Judges 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. There is a pattern that is common, though, in these chapters, and it's pointed out by a recurring phrase. And we'll get to that toward the end of the lesson, Lord willing, if Dean doesn't ring the bell too soon. Chapter 17 and 18 have to do with the tribe of Dan taking their inheritance. And this story may have happened earlier than we would expect it to. We expect it to go chronologically and be happening at the end of the book of Judges, but it very likely happened earlier, and there are a couple of reasons for that. If you go back to Joshua, in Joshua chapter 19, they continued to divide up the land by lot. In Joshua 19, verse 40, it says, "The 7th lot fell to the tribe of the sons of Dan according to their families." And then the territory of their inheritance was Zorah and Eshtal, and so forth. And then in verse 47, "And the territory of the sons of Dan proceeded beyond them, for the sons of Dan went up and fought with Leshem and captured it. Then they struck it with the edge of the sword and possessed it and settled in it. And they called Leshem Dan after the name of Dan their father. This was the inheritance of the tribe, the sons of Dan, according to their families, these cities with their villages." And so if you'll just file that away in your mind, that they took this territory, and that they fought against Leshem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and named it Dan, after their forefather Dan. In Judges chapter 1, you remember that although some of this land was allotted, they did not necessarily take possession of it the way they should have. They had the land, but they didn't follow the directions to take it. And in Judges chapter 1, from verse 34, it says, "The Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shelbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor." And so those descriptions may be about the same time of the story we're reading tonight, of what happens in chapters 17 and 18. There's a man in the hill country of Ephraim, and his name is Micah. Ephraim is kind of north and west of Jerusalem. They live in that area north and west of Jerusalem, the hill country of Ephraim. And what does he tell his mother? What has he done with his mother's silver? He took it, which is a nice way to say he stole it. He stole her 1,100 pieces of silver. there's no indication here of how much that is, how much that's worth. But you notice a little bit later, the salary that they give to the priest, the Levite priest, is his allowance, his upkeep and a change of clothing and 10 pieces of silver a year. So his actual salary was 10 pieces of silver a year. This is 1,100 pieces of silver. And so however much this is a substantial amount of money. He has stolen it, and what does he do with it then? He gives it back to her, and there may be a motivation from that, because he says that, that 1,100 pieces of silver, what went along with the stealing of that silver? A curse. She uttered a curse on whoever it was that stole that money. And he said, I heard that curse in my ear. And that may be his motivation to give it back to her. He did not want to experience the consequence of the curse. She cursed whoever took the money, and he didn't really want that curse to go to him. And so what's her response then when he fesses up? Blessed be my son by the Lord. Not my reaction exactly, but blessed be my son by the Lord.
Was she removing the curse?
Yeah, see, the curse was replaced with a blessing. The blessing negates the curse. It neutralizes the curse. And so she had pronounced the curse, and now she pronounces a blessing, and that undoes the curse. So yeah, that's what happens, is the curse takes the place, or the blessing takes the place of the curse. And he gave it to his mother, and then what did his mother do with it? What does she say? I'm going to wholly dedicate this silver to the Lord for my son to do what? To make a graven image and a molten image, and so she gave him back to her son. What is wrong with this picture?
Everything.
Like everything is wrong with this picture? She says, I'm going to give it to Jehovah, so why don't you make some idols out of it? Of course, that's not too far from what Aaron did when Moses was up on the mountain. He said, well, here's the God that brought you out of Egypt, this calf.
So he didn't want her curse. Why is he willing to accept the curse that God pronounced on those idols?
See, that's a good question. If he was afraid of her curse, why wasn't he afraid of God's curse? There are a lot of questions like that along here. What do they really expect to benefit from these things? Somebody who is obviously not following Jehovah, why do they expect Jehovah to bless them? Why do you go to the trouble of making idols to Jehovah and expect to be blessed as a result of it? And so she took part of the money, 200 pieces of silver, and gave them to the silversmith to make a graven image and a molten idol. One's cast and one is tooled. And they put them in his house, Micah's house. Well, it's not good for commerce anymore, but it's still there. The weight, the silver was more by weight than by coinage. It's not like there was a silver dollar. No, you couldn't use it for that. What's that? You could always melt it back down and make little pieces out of it. But there seems to be some motivation of greed throughout a lot of this. First of all, the son's motivation of greed to take the money in the first place. And not only do they have these two idols, the molten idol and the graven image, then Micah sets up a shrine, and he adds household idols. And then what did he do? He consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. What do you expect out of this? Who are the priests? The Levites are priests. And to just choose somebody, starting out choosing somebody to be your priest for molten images and graven images, and think that Jehovah's going to benefit you any, is just pretty far out there. I think verse 6, though, is the key to understanding these last 5 chapters, because it's repeated. And in chapter 17, verse 6, what does it say to explain this? In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Remember, this may have come earlier in the conquest of Canaan than later. How does chapter 18 begin? The same way. How does chapter 19 begin? Same way. How does the book end? Same way. That phrase is just used throughout 17, 18, 19, and 20, or 21, and it explains what's happening, what's going on. Just anarchy, chaos. People are not obeying God. And if we fit this back in the period of the conquest, it makes more sense, because what were the Israelites constantly doing during the period of Judges? Disobeying God and following idols. And so it makes perfect sense during that period, because this is what they were doing all the time. But that's the explanation given in chapter 17. They did this because everybody was doing whatever they wanted to do. Of course, there's not a message there for us today. How many people do whatever they want to and then expect God to be okay with it? How many people today religiously just do anything that comes to mind and think God has to be all right with this? Now, he's a loving God. He's understanding. He's merciful. He's full of grace. And so he'll like whatever it is we do. I don't think he likes what's going on in Judges, and I don't think it's any better today when we do the same thing. We just figure we're going to get God's blessings and God's benefits regardless of whether we do what God tells us to do.
I think we also look towards other people. So I feel like in churches where that's like the thing to do, where it's a thing to think that God's merciful regardless of your lifestyle, they also look to other people within that congregation and think, well, he's more holy than I can just tell, and he does this, so
Yeah.
it must be okay to do that. So we also justify ourselves
Sure.
throughout other Christians that we
Right. We look to other humans. We look to other humans for our source of example, instead of just going back to the source here and getting what it says here, instead of looking to other people around us. And that's a little bit of what happens here, because Micah is going to be an influence on what Micah does. Influences the whole tribe of Dan. If Micah would not have done what he did, I don't think the tribe of Dan, at least in this situation, would have done what they did, because he did it first, and they copied him. He consecrated his son to become priest, but he thought, I've got a better idea, because who did he run across? What's that? Yeah, there's a Levite who came to town. What's better than having your own son be a priest? Having a Levite be a priest. Here's a man that came from Bethlehem, and what was he doing? He just trying to find a place. What territory did the Levites get? We have territory that's given to Judah and Reuben and Simeon. What territory did they get? They didn't. They were kind of scattered out among the tribes, and so this isn't so unusual perhaps for him to be just kind of wandering around looking for a place. And he came into this hill country, and Micah quizzed him on who he was and where he was from. And what offer did Micah make? Yes, dwell with me, and you can be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year. And that probably explains what the rest of the silver is used for. You have 1,100 pieces of silver, and they only use 200 to make the actual two idols, and the rest is probably used just for maintenance, ongoing maintenance. And I'll give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and we'll give you your maintenance to take care of you. And so the Levite went in.
See, everything's wrong with that, too.
Everything's wrong with that, too. Why were the Levites scattered around throughout the territory?
Because they were to be teaching.
They were the teachers who were to teach the Israelites God's law. That was their job. And if you had them all congregated in one area, then they wouldn't be out there teaching the people. The Levites were to be out among the people to teach them what God wanted.
And
Yeah, and God would have provided for them, did provide for them as they went and did this. And so the problem here is, instead of him going out and teaching and saying, Micah, you know, this is not really what God wants. This is not a good idea. He said, sounds good to me. I've got a job. And so Micah hires him, and he is really happy to do this. Micah consecrates him, or puts the money in his hand, and he lived in Micah's house. And look at Micah's expectation in verse 13.
The Lord's going to be good to me because I've got a Levite in my house.
I've got a Levite in my house. I think at one point, didn't one of the prophets warn against people who say, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord? We've had the house of the Lord right here, so we're going to be A-okay. Micah said, I've got a Levite priest, everything is going to be great. And there again, how many people today think just by using a certain terminology it's going to make everything okay, when it's not founded on what God wants? So everything is copacetic. Everything is going just fine here. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And the Danites were seeking inheritance for themselves to live in. For until that day, an inheritance had not been allotted to them as a possession among the tribes of Israel. Which makes it sound as if it's back during that time when they were casting lots and the territory fell to them. But they hadn't occupied it. They hadn't taken it yet. And so what do the people of Dan do, the Danites? They choose 5 men, 5 spies from Zorah and Eshtaol. And if you go back to some of those previous accounts, that's the area where they were living previously, in Zorah and Eshtaol. And they sent them out to go spy out the land and search the land. They came to the hill country of Ephraim, and they came to Micah's house, and they stayed there. But then they hear somebody talking, and they recognize his accent. Who do they recognize? They hear the accent of this Levite from Bethlehem. And it's just, look at all the questions. Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here? And what's his explanation? Micah did this, he hired me, and I have become his priest. And so they want to know everything that's happened, and he tells them. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, that's a question, whether verse 6, whether he just did that on his own, because a lot of times people did that. They gave their response without asking God what it was. It did come true, but whether or not he asked God about it's another question. We don't know whether he actually inquired. It doesn't sound like there's much time that transpires between them saying, go ask God, and him saying, this is what God said. And whether or not it happened on this occasion, that is a major problem with false prophets. If you look at the prophets, the book of the prophets, the one thing that false prophets did is said there was peace when there's no peace. They said, everything's okay, don't worry, there's peace when there's no peace. In this case, it did work out the way he said. But he said that they were going with the Lord's approval. They have the Lord's approval. I don't know that he would have the ability to get the Lord's approval, since he's worshiping idols and all the things that he's doing. They come to what's described here as Laish. And that's not the same name that we saw before, but it's possible for a town to have more than one name. They come to to Laish, and what do they find? People are living in security, in peace, after the manner of the Sidonians. Up north in Phoenicia, the Tyre and Sidon, and they were so confident they didn't even have to have any protection. They just were all right. And these people were living in that same manner, quiet, secure. They didn't have any ruler that was invading or anything. And they were just off in the country living by themselves, just having fun, peaceful. The 5 spies went back to the tribe in Dan, the rest of the tribe in Dan, and what did they say? Hey, this is awesome. They will go back to Zorah and Eshtaol, and they asked them, what is your report? What was the report of the spies? Let's go. Let's go up against them, for we have seen the land. It is very good. And why are you sitting here? Don't delay. Go and enter to possess the land. The spies come in and encourage them to go in, which is the opposite of what the 10 of the spies did whenever they were sent out to spy Canaan. They said, it's really a great place, but we can't do it. These spies say, hey, it's a great place, and we need to go in and take it, because these people are totally unprotected. It's just, there's nothing lacking there. 600 soldiers then, 600 armed men from Zorah and Eshtaol of Danites set out. And they go on and they come up to the hill country of Ephraim, and they come to the house of Micah. And what do the 5 spies say to them? Do you know what there is here in this town? There is a house with an ephod and household idols and a graven image and a molten image. And if you go back, the mother set aside the money for the molten image and the graven image. Then Micah went ahead and did the ephod and the household idols, the teraphim. What is an ephod? For the high priest, it was part of his garment. It was like an apron. It was joined at the top, front and back. And it had the breastplate on the front and the 2 pieces on the shoulder piece. But it was a special part of his clothing. And you run into that word different times throughout the Old Testament. Gideon made an ephod, which makes it sound like it's something different from the priest's clothing. Because if you go back to the story of Gideon, in chapter 8, Judges 8, in verse 26, they take a lot of gold, and Gideon makes it into an ephod. And that's obviously not a piece of clothing. That's something that's made out of metal. And so you'll find the priest wearing an ephod, but I think you find the boy Samuel wearing an ephod. You find David wearing a linen ephod. And so some cases it's a piece of clothing, but sometimes it's not. It's something different. The word literally means something that's bound, something that's wrapped. And so whatever the meaning is, what's happening here is not, I don't think, what the priests wore. It was some kind of an idol type thing, or something that they could turn to. They would sometimes go to the ephod to ask questions. The Urim, the Thummim, and those were in the pouch, weren't they? They were inside the pouch. Yeah, it could have been. It was that they would go there to divine, to ask God's favor for things, and that's probably what this is. It's some kind of a place where you go for fortune telling, divination, and so that's probably where the binding comes in. Maybe even in that pouch or whatever. But I don't think this is a piece of clothing. I think it's object made out of precious metal. And so Micah had not only made the two idols, he had made household idols, a number of them, and then also this ephod. I think that teraphim is one that we run into every now and then. Isn't that what David's wife Micah hid in the bed to make it look like he was in the bed? I think it might be described that same word in there. So David had one of these in his house, or at least his wife did. So these five men explain that there is a house here that has all of these things in there. So let's think about what we want to do with this. And what did they want to do with this? They went there and they went to the Levite and said, ask about his welfare. How you doing? Doing all right? Everything going okay? They were interested in his welfare. They wanted to make sure everything was going. They were not interested in his welfare. They asked him of his welfare. Now, here are 600 armed men, warriors, right there at the gate. And so what do the five men do? They go in and they start carrying these things off. They carry off the graven image and the ephod and the household idols and the molten image. And the priest is standing there at the entrance of the gate along with 600 warriors. And what does the priest say to them? What are you doing? What are you doing? And their response was, be quiet. Put your hand over your mouth. Just be silent. Come with us. Micah had wanted this priest to be a father to him and a priest to him. In chapter 18 and verse 19, these five spies say, come with us and be a father and a priest to us. Which is better, to be a priest for one individual or to be the priest for a whole tribe? Which would you choose? Yeah, that's the thing, the priest of what? You would choose neither. But this guy chose, I think I'll choose to be a priest of the whole tribe. Just think, if Micah could pay him 10 pieces of silver a year, I wonder what a whole tribe could pay him. And if he could only get one change of clothing from Micah, I wonder how much a whole tribe could provide for him. This is a good deal. It's a good business opportunity. In fact, it says in verse 20, his heart was glad. So he took those things, the ephod, the idols, and went along with the people. In verse 21, I don't know if they were carrying these things off from that village or the things that they had with them, but as they leave, they put the little ones and the livestock and the valuables in front of them. There's nothing anywhere that really indicates where that came from, if they helped themselves or what happened. They had headed out, and then what happens? Micah hears about it, and the people around Micah's house assembled and they ran after them. Now, you remember a lot of times that armies were local militia, like Abraham had servants who were in his army, and these are just his neighbors who were going out after the people from Dan. What do the people of Dan ask him? What is the matter with you? Which would have been a good question to ask several places in these chapters, is what is the matter with you? It should have started with the fact that he stole the money from his mother and went downhill from there. But when they decided to build idols for the glory of Jehovah, somebody should have said, what's the matter with you? Why have you assembled together? Basically what they're saying is, you really want to fight us. You've gathered your neighbors together, and you have really assembled, huh? You put together an army. And what did he say? There's no longer any pretext of worshiping the one God. I mean, Aaron could say that the calf was really just a representation of Jehovah. It wasn't another God. It was just a representation. And Micah might have been able to have been wrong, but might have been able to suggest, these are not gods. These are just representations of Jehovah. But he makes it very clear here that what they have taken from him is not just his stuff. They have taken his gods, which I have made. Love's not a good word. I really appreciate all the times in the prophets where God points out, okay, you people, you take a log and you cut it and you cook your food over part of it, and then you shape the rest of it and you bow down to it and said, you made me. And God says, just think about it. What are you doing? And he says, you're taking my gods, which I made, away from me. And again, fortunately today, we do not worship gods that we make. We do not worship gods of our own making. What gods do we worship today?
Anything we put before him.
Gods of our own making.
Anything that we do instead.
Yeah, we make our own gods, don't we? We make our own gods, things that we place the highest value on, things that we may even, although we won't admit it, place it above God. Greed, covetousness are the two things that are listed as idolatry in the New Testament. But anything that we place in that position is a god, not just an idol. It's easy to talk about idols because that's kind of, but to talk about a god, not just making an idol, but making another god. And sadly, that happens all too often in our society today, is we make our own gods. And they might be people, they might be actors, actresses, singers, performers, athletes. It might be money, it might be our job, it might be any one of a number of things. But people still make their own gods. And as long as we're worshiping the God that we made, there's not much hope for us. Because the gods that we make cannot save us. And the gods we make are not worthy of praise. Yeah, they can't condemn us, and that's probably why people like them so much. The gods that we make will do whatever we tell them to do. And the gods we make say, oh, what you're doing is fine. That's great. Keep up the good work. So,
We have to fear the one who does judge us.
yeah, we need to fear the one that we don't make, the one who made us. And that's another thing throughout the prophets in the Old Testament. God is often introduced as the one who made the universe. Thus says the God who made everything. You did not make him. He made you, and he made everything else. But this poor guy says, you're taking my gods that I made. And yeah, it's kind of like Gideon's father when he tore down the Asheroth and the Baal's altar, and the people said, you got to bring him out and we can kill him. And Gideon's father said, if he's a god, let him fight for himself. If he's a god, he'll take care of it if he's a god. And since he didn't, that kind of answered that. And so he says, how can you say what's the matter with me? You did this, you took my gods. And then they gave him the stern warning, and what did they say? You better just keep quiet. Do not let us hear your voice anymore. Just lest some powerful men, fierce men, fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household. And basically they say, gone about far enough with this little charade, with your little army against these 600 warriors. You may want to go back home before you get hurt. What's his option? He goes home. He takes their advice, and he starts looking at their army and his army, and he says, I think I'll go home. And what he had lost was nothing but 1,100 pieces of silver, because he didn't lose any gods. He didn't lose anything of any lasting value. Well, 200 in these, but he used some of the others for other things. I don't know how much he had left over, but even if he lost the whole 1,100, it's no big loss. What's that? It wasn't his to start with. He stole it, and then he gave it back, and his mother gave it to him. And so he turned and went home. The people of Dan then take what he has made. Shouldn't that be a clue to them? They want gods that he made. And the priest who had belonged to him, he's the one that consecrated the priest. And so they took the gods that he made and the priest that he made, and they come to Laish, the people who are quiet and secure. They strike them with the edge of the sword. They burn the city with fire. Nobody around to protect them. There wasn't anybody around to bother them. So there's nobody around to protect them. And so they just destroy the city. And in verse 29, what does it say about the name of the city? They named the city Dan, after Dan, their father. And if you remember that story back in the account back in Joshua 19, it says that they fought against Leshem and struck it with the edge of the sword and called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their father. And so that's what one of the things that make it seem as if it might be the same thing happening back in Joshua. And so if so, this story would fit back there and not after Samson. And then what did the sons of Dan do in their new territory? They set up for themselves the graven image, and I'm sure the rest of the idolatry. And now we have the priest mentioned, the Levite. And what's his name? His name is Jonathan, there in verse 30. Jonathan, the son of Gershom. And the New American Standard says the son of Manasseh. But some of your other translations are going to have something different other than Manasseh. What do the other translations have? And it's a marginal reading in the New American Standard. It has Moses. Was Moses' son, and that would make him a Levite, and that would farther help us place this chronologically, because this guy who's this priest here, if this is accurate, is Moses' grandson. So this isn't at the end of the period of the conquest of the judges. It's back earlier. And so they set him and his sons to be the priests of the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. And so all through that history. And I said this does not fit with the rest of the book of Judges, but in a sense it does, because most of the others focus on that period when God sent a deliverer. This may be during the period that the first period, which is the Israelites disobeyed God and turned away from God. and then he sent the oppressor, and then they cried out, and so forth. So this may actually fit with the book of Judges with that part of it toward the beginning. One of the occasions, a specific example of when they turned away from God to idolatry. And if it's not one of the specific ones, it's sure a good example of what was going on. And so it wraps up in verse 31. They set up for themselves Micah's graven image as their primary idol, apparently. And when did they do this? What period was this? All the time that the house of God was at Shiloh. And that was a pretty long period, because when we get into Samuel and Eli, that's happening in Shiloh. And so it was still, after the period, toward the end of the period of the Judges, they were still in Shiloh. So that's a pretty long period of time, and that doesn't help us date it specifically.
It says in verse 30 at the end that the sons were, he was priest to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Is that like
I would guess that would be till the time of the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
so then this book would have been written?
And so, that family may have been the Levites and the priests in that area from then on. This story is recorded here to explain how that came to be. That eventually this family would be the Levites and the priests, and this is how it happened. But it's just another case of, we assume things are going to be in chronological order. This, and then this, and then this, and this. And so our assumption is this story takes place after Samson. It's after Samson in the book, so therefore the time period is after Samson. But the details don't fit. The details fit with the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges. But there is I think a major underlying lesson for us in this is, what did these people really expect to get?
Well, God tells us not to expect anything.
Yeah, and I don't know why Micah thought that having a Levite was going to be any better. Just by having the name, I guess.
Well, his own personal priest.
Yeah, for his own personal priest. But if you're making everything up, what difference does it make? But he just figured somehow God would bless him because he had a Levite.
Why? And then, I don't know, maybe I'll never, but why did the Levite go along with it? He should.
Well, I think I can guess why the Levite went along with it. The Levite was looking for a job, and first of all, he found a good job, and then he found a really good job. And in all of this, did the Levite ever do his job? No, he didn't. And if this is if we're right about the lineage there, it wouldn't have been that part of the Levite's tribe's job to serve in the temple, because only the sons of Aaron would have served in the temple. The Levites would have done periphery things, and it was their job to teach the people, but it was not their job to carry out the actual temple worship. And so he's assuming on himself, he's a Levite, but he's assuming on himself the role of a descendant of Aaron. If he's taking care of the worship part of it and taking care of all that, he's being pretty presumptuous. So he's not doing what he's supposed to in any way, shape, or form. But we just need to make sure that we don't do the same thing. It's easy for us to look back and say, oh, wow, that was really bad idea. And we don't look around us and say, this is really a bad idea. Just because we use the right terminology, just because we say the right words, just because this and that does not guarantee us what we're looking for. And they thought that just by going through the motions and having this one guy, it was going to be okay with God, and it was not okay with God. And it was a result of not having anybody, a king or a Levite, to tell them the right thing to do. Everybody just did whatever they wanted. And so that's going to be the story. The other story is in chapters 19 and following. And that also involves a a Levite, and also involves a situation where there's just total anarchy and disorder in the land. And I think that's the whole point, is that these are periods of disobedience, of not turning to God and relying on God. And so the warning to us is to don't do that. And don't worship gods that we've made. Okay, don't read chapters 19 and following in preparation for next week, or you'll be too prepared. Thank you very much. We're out a little bit early because you didn't